Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session on implementing observability at any scale. My name is Chris Harding. I'm a solutions engineer at Epsagon, where we provide a trace-centric observability platform really tailored towards modern microservice environments. And so very happy to be here giving this lightning talk on observability, which we very much think is something that's going to be a big trend coming into the new year. All right, great. So just a level set on what we'll be discussing today, we're going to talk a little bit about microservices, right? That new normal, this transition from monoliths to microservices, the benefits of which there are many, as well as the challenges. We'll talk about how you troubleshoot these highly distributed environments. We'll talk about where distributed tracing fits into that overall discussion. And then we'll talk about, for those of you who are in the early stages of looking at observability, what that journey might look like. All right, great. Let's dive right in. All right, so I don't think this is anything new here for any of the attendees of the presentation, but I just want to talk a little bit about the context of what we're going to be discussing here. And so, what we've seen a lot over the past, let's say, 10, 15 years is very much this idea of the rise of microservices, right? Historically, applications were very much monolithic, based on premise. There was a shift towards microservices, again, very much sort of host-based on premise. But now we're in this world where everything's in the cloud. The tools that you're using as part of your application are becoming more and more diverse, right? Whether that's something like third-party APIs like Stripe, whether that's SQS, SNS, Dynamo, all these different tools, it makes it very difficult to understand what's going on throughout these very complex environments. And so while microservices are great, they bring a lot of benefits as it relates to developer velocity. They also have drawbacks as well. All right, and so what are those challenges? We have some bullet points here, but just broad strokes, the challenges are really around understanding what's going on within these complex environments, both when things are going well, but more importantly, when things ultimately go wrong. And so we have customers here at Epsagon who have tens, hundreds, even thousands of microservices, and it becomes very difficult using traditional tools to understand when something breaks, ultimately where that break has taken place. And we'll look at that a little bit here. So let's look at traditional troubleshooting and what that workflow has historically looked like. And so, of course, step one, the problem arrives, right? Whether that's coming from Sentry or any other alerting tool, you now know that something within your application is not working as expected. So this message here gives us a lot of information, but it might not be the complete picture, right? Even though we have a service that has produced a failure, it could very well be not due to that service itself, right? But something earlier downstream. Maybe it's getting a payload that's malformed. Maybe it's getting incorrect data in that payload. And so just knowing that a service failed doesn't necessarily help us understand where that failure happened. And so traditionally, what are we going to do? We're going to dig into our logs. Of course, logs are very valuable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but they have their limitations in this new world where you have so many services running concurrently, right? And so you might have to go and find the logs for service A, correlate those to service B, hope that the issue's there. If not, continue that chain. And it makes troubleshooting and remediation a really difficult task, again, in these modern environments. All right, so where are we going with this, right? Something is missing from this equation. How are we able to correlate between metrics and logs, right? Metrics tell us what, logs tell us why. How do we correlate these same data between all of these different services we use? Some of those services, are services we wrote ourselves. Others are managed services, right? Like Kafka or SQS. And more importantly, how do we find the where when something goes wrong? So you must be thinking to yourself, Chris, you're giving this presentation. There must be a better way. And there is. And so for us at Epsagon, that better way is largely distributed tracing. All right, now what is distributed tracing? I'll let you read the little blurb here, but essentially the ability to trace a transaction from start to finish throughout your entire application, right? And that transaction might be hitting one, two, 10, hundreds, or even thousands of services. Having that full end-to-end view in order to help you understand what's going on under the hood. Distributed tracing very much was born out of Google over a decade ago when they were trying to solve this exact problem, right? Google, very advanced at the time, having all these microservices, they were spending a tremendous amount of time troubleshooting. And so they came up with the idea of tracing to help them really track and understand what was going on within those systems. And so when we talk about observability, right, at a very high level, what does that mean? Well, to us at Epsagon, what that means is essentially having three pillars available to you in a highly correlated way. And so as we mentioned, metrics can tell us what, logs can tell us why, but it's really traces that tell us where, and traces that allow us to correlate all of these data in a way that gives us that holistic overview of what's going on within these environments. All right, so let's look at some of the benefits. We looked at that traditional troubleshooting workflow, which can be very tedious and time consuming. When you have a good distributed tracing tool in place, it becomes much more streamlined, right? And so here's an example from the Epsagon platform of a full business transaction where we've ultimately generated an error. And so what's nice is having not only that visual representation, but having the ability to see that stack trace, to be able to click into those logs and see just the logs for this one specific request, right? And now having this full transaction, we no longer have to correlate these logs ourselves. We can simply step back and let's look at the logs for this Lambda, right? We can step back and we can ultimately really understand quickly and efficiently where these issues may be arising. All right. Very important when we talk about observability. Again, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it's important to keep in mind the richness of the data that you get from your tracing implementation is ultimately where you're going to derive that value. And so here at Epsagon, what that means to us is providing as much value, as much rich data as possible. That's going to include, for example, things like that payload information, right? We're going to collect this out of the box, make it available to you. Very helpful for that troubleshooting piece, but also helpful because we can leverage all of that payload data in a good observability tool in a number of different ways. Right. So what are some of those ways, right? Having rich trace data allows you to not only see an actual business transaction and step through for things like troubleshooting or analysis, that data can also be leveraged to create these really interesting visualizations, and not just necessarily of a technical nature, right? By having that full payload data, we can build visualizations that are more business insights, right? Let's pull the value field out of our Kafka service. The quantity field out of our Kafka service. That represents how many items have been ordered within our application. And so that's a really valuable metric we can get just by virtue of having that full payload data available to us out of the box. Very similar when it comes to errors, being able to slice and dice them in really intelligent and valuable ways, whether that's trying to see errors based on status or based on type or any other number of aggregations or slices. All right, where else can we leverage that really rich trace data with very customized alerts, right? Whether that's creating alerts based off the trace data itself, right? Leveraging that payload information, or whether it's trying to create alerts just based off higher level metrics around things like Lambda or Kubernetes. Having all of this rich data, both at the resource level and the application level, gives you great coverage when it comes to monitoring and ultimately proactively being alerted to issues within your environment. All right, great. So just finishing us off here, talking a little bit about the journey to observability. Of course, you want to identify what are your business goals. What does your architecture look like, right? Is it microservices? Is it monolithic? Is it a hybrid? because that's going to ultimately drive a decision on what solution you might use. But you also have to determine your approach, right? There are many open source tools for distributed tracing. Of course, those are free. With any open source tool, they require a lot of resources from you, the end user. You have to manually instrument your code, make changes, tell it what data to collect, or you can go with a managed solution where all of that happens automatically with no need for code changes at all. Right? That implementation, of course, is going to be very much determined by what your approach looks like. It can be very simple with a tool like Epsagon, or a little bit more in-depth if you are going with open source. And then, of course, always ensure that your observability strategy can scale with your business, right? We have customers who have billions of requests that are very cyclical based on time of day or weekends. It's important to have a tool in place for observability that can scale alongside with you. All right, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time. I hope that gives you a great high-level overview of observability as we come into 2021, the value that it provides, and also some of the important considerations that you should take into account when deciding how to move forward with your own observability strategy. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.